All right, so I copied over some of the code from our curriculum page just to kind of talk about it and touch upon some of the points we introduced in lecture this morning. So here I copied over this button class. Where did it go? Right here. So this button component. No, not that one. Or am I here? Yes, this button component. Sorry, this button component I copied over. And then I also copied over this app. So we have a component in its own file of button component. I actually put it in source components without a nested folder here, and copy over this into my app.js. All right, not sure if you guys are following along, but if you guys want to, again, you grab the code off the curriculum page. So what that yields is an app.js as such. Notice this app.js is actually a class-based component. So again, you might see examples in both. So kind of be prepared to understand what's going on in each. So in this case, we have class app extends React component. I guess in this case, we could change this to component. And then we don't need the React dots. All right, so again, this is essentially inheritance, where component is our base class, app is our derived class or child class. Then we have a simple render that returns a div with a button component as a child component. If we move over to button component, this is again what I copied over from the curriculum page. So hopefully, if you do want to kind of follow along, you can copy that. We have a button component. Again, we're extending the base component. Here we have something that I don't think we touched upon. Is this is how you create a state value in a class-based component. So it's a little different than when you're using a function-based component. And then when you want to update a state value, you need to call this.setState and pass the item that you want to actually update. So in this case, we create a state value, which is an object that has one member, which is count. Its value is 0 by default. Then anytime this handle button click is called, we're going to call set state and increment the state by 1. All right, if we go a bit lower, we see our render method. So basically every component should have a render method. This render method is going to return this item. So we're going to have a div, and that div is going to have 2 items in it. We have an h1 tag that basically displays the count. And the second item is a button that when it's clicked, will call handle button click. So let's actually see this in action. Any questions about this code? All right, so once you have this up and running, again, button component app.js, you get that running, you get something that should look like this. So I have been clicked 0 times. When we click this button, notice that we start counting. So we're at 1. We click it 6 times. We see that I've been clicked 6 times. We keep going. There's no real upper limit until you get probably till integer max, which is like 4 billion something, I think. All right, so we have, again, one button component, which is composed of this h1 tag and this button. That's part of, those are the child elements, I guess, of the button component. As we kind of talked about in lecture, we can reuse this button component as many times as we want. So let's create multiple instances of it. So I create, let's say, 4 button components, right? So each one of these is a unique instance of button component. Again, if you kind of shift your mind back to the OOP weeks, we have a class button component, and all the data within button component is unique to each instance. So if we look at button component here, this state value, this count is only valid for this particular instance. If we have a different button component instance, then this count is going to be totally separate for that particular instance. So if I run this code, again, I have 4 instances. Notice I have 4 renderings of the button component. If I click one button, notice that only this particular component updates with 1. These button components are not using the same value that this button component's using. Each component has its own internal state. So in this case, the state of this component has a count value of 1. If I click it more, notice that only this updates. Likewise, I can click another one and only that component will update because state values, again, are tied to an instance. They're not shared across all instances. So we go back to OOP discussion. These aren't class level attributes or variables that are being shared here. They're instance attributes. Or in React speak, they are state values that are local to each instance. What questions do you guys have about states? All right, no questions. So I'm going to take this example and make it a little more complex just so we can understand usually how we structure items in React. All right, and as always, if I'm going too fast, please ask me to slow down or just ask questions if I lose you along the way. So what I'm going to do here is actually dive into my button component, and I want to separate out 2 pieces of logic. I want to separate out my input, which is in this case the button. So the user's clicking a button, and then we have an output here, which is what we actually show from the button being pressed. So again, I don't have to separate these out. They seem to work well enough, but just for our example here, I'm going to separate them out into individual components, just so we can see how we design input and output components. All right, so to do that, I'm going to create a new file in my components folder. So inside my source directory, I have a components folder. I'm going to create a new component, call it outputs component. I don't think normally we need to call them components. We can just call them button output, but I'll keep the name consistent here. So here, I want to create a class-based component since we're using class-based components. So React class component. And then I'll call this outputs component. All right, so this is my bare bones structure for a class-based component. You need to import component, have a class that extends component, and have a render method that returns something. Okay, so in here, I'm going to grab this h1 tag and move it over to my output. All right, so now my output component, its only job, and this is the single responsibility principle, its only job is just to display the output. Again, in my design decision, I decided I don't want my output and input to be in the same component. I want to be separate blocks or logical blocks in my code. So here, the only job of this is to display some value. But in this case, we don't have a state value to show because that state value doesn't exist within this component. So let's leave that blank for now. I'm just going to leave, we'll just say insert count here. All right, so that's going to be a placeholder. We're going to replace this eventually with some value, but I'm going to save that and then go to my app.js. And here, let's see, maybe let's create another component. Let's call this combo component. No, I'm not going to do this. Sorry. Okay, so now my button component only has a button in it, and then my output only has the output. So I'm going to go back to my app.js, delete the redundancy here, and I'm just going to have one button component, which again only has the button, and an output component. So output component, output, and I'm going to put this below my button this time instead of above, just to change it up a bit. All right. Any questions so far? All righty then. Continue on. If I save this, now we have this button and an output that has static text in it. So if I look at my code here, notice I have a button up top and then a message saying I haven't clicked insert count here number of times. So now we need to actually somehow get a value from somewhere and pass it down to this component. Can anyone think of what type of, I guess, variable or value would be passed? What's the name of that if you pass it from a parent down to a child component?
Gonna pass it like a prop from the button to the output.
Yep. Yeah, so what we have right now is a parent component of app. We have two child components. One is called button and the other one's output. So Jack said he didn't mention props. We need to pass a prop down to our output component. So let's call that prop count. Simple enough. And let's just pass it a simple value right now. Let's pass it 8. So we're going to hard code a value just to see this in play. So I'm passing a count value of 8. Now, if I go to my output component, instead of this placeholder, I could actually add in this dot props dot count. Okay, so we're passing a props value from our parent, like so, and then that's being captured in this dot props object. And now we added a count method, or not a method, sorry, a count value that will be present for this component. So if I save this, again, this is a prop that's coming from our parent. There we go, there's our parent. So that value should be 8 if I save it. Notice we get 8 here. All right, cool. So if I click this button, nothing changes, right? Because we kind of separate out the two logical pieces, so they're no longer communicating with each other. When I click this button, what's happening is, go to my button component, I'm updating this count value in the button, but this count value is totally separate from the count value that we're passing down to our other component. So the next question becomes, how do we actually get a value out of this component, which actually has that count, and then pass it to this component here? You guys following along with the challenge here? So button component has a value in it, but we don't want it to kind of just have that value to itself. So this is where this design paradigm will come fairly frequently, is we need our parent to be the manager of that data. My tabs seem to be inconsistent. All right, so right now button component is holding on to that value. We don't want that. We want the parent to hold it because the parent has access to both of these child components. So what I'm going to do is go to my button component, say, grab the state, and put that state into my parents. Okay, so now my parent is holding on to count. Now, whatever this count value is, I could pass it down here. All right, so right now, if the initial value is 0, this count value that's going to be passed down to output is going to be 0. Likewise, I'm going to go back to my button component and grab the handler, so handle button click, and move that to my app. Now let's call this something a little different. Let's say update count. All right, so update count should take in some value. I guess it's going to increment count, so not update it. Increment count. When this function gets called, we're going to just update the state value in our parent now. All right, so we're getting the pieces together. We have a count value that we can pass down to our output. But the last challenge is, how do we actually get a value out of the button component? So this is where we pass down another prop. So here I'll call it, what do I want to call it? Maybe handle, let's just call it something, increment count. And that I'm going to pass it the function that I created up here. Again, these names do not have to match. So I probably, for a better example, I could rename this. Like, I'm blanking on a name right now. Anyone have an idea?
Handle click.
All right, handle click. All right, so again, we can name this whatever we want. This is the function we're passing it. So this function is going to be called if we invoke it. Right now, we're just passing the function pointer. We're not actually calling the function here. Again, there's a big difference between this and this. This is a common mistake that I've made plenty of times. I've seen students make it. If you put this parentheses here, that's going to mean this is going to be invoked kind of right away, which is not what we want. We don't want this function called right now. We want it called when something else might happen. All right, so now we're passing another prop, a different prop, down to our button component. So we go back to our button component. We make one more change. So previously we had some function in this method called handle button click that no longer exists. We moved it out to the parent. So instead we're going to use the props, this dot props handle click. Let me quiz someone in the audience. Jonas, you're still first on my screen. I know I chatted with you earlier. Can you tell me where the name of this comes from? Where am I getting this.props.handle click?
This is coming from, I guess it'd be the equivalent of self if it were Python. Props, I believe you declared it on the other page as same with that handle click, you declared that as the function on the other page.
Yep, so I think you got the 3 pieces there. So this, again, refers to the particular instance that exists. That's what I think John's getting at. Yeah, so the same as the self keyword in Python. This props is automatically created. It's not something we're creating. It's just an object that exists for any component that you create. This.props is just going to be a dictionary, sorry, an object in JavaScript that exists. By default, it's not going to have any values attached to it. But this handle click, I think as Joan has mentioned also, is coming from this name that we set here. So that name and the name in our button components have to match. If I change this to XYZ, then this button component has to read this.props XYZ. What questions do you guys have about passing down props? Does it make sense here? So I'm going to name this again back to handle click because that's more sensible than XYZ. So
this is the like class-based way of passing around props between like 2 separate class components, or would this also be the exact same for a function style?
Passing of the props will be exactly the same in terms of how you pass them down. So class-based, function-based, the syntax here is going to be exactly the same. The way you access it from the child component. So in this, apologies, in this case, we have this.props handle click. Let's actually do a quick tangent here. I'm going to create a function-based component just to see what this looks like. Always good to kind of have both structures in mind. So in this case, I'm going to create a function. We're going to call it button components function. I'm going to put them side by side here, just so we can see them. Maybe I should split screen it, but let me know if this doesn't make sense. Here, this will take in props, and this will return something. So function, kind of less bloat, so it's much simpler. In this case, we'll return the same thing. The only difference here is instead of this.props, you want to just do props. So keep that in mind. Props being passed here into this function, we have access to that props here. And in class, this.props automatically just exists. We don't have to manually like pass it down to our class. Either way, this handle click is coming from how we pass it down to our component. All right, so I could do this. This would do the same exact thing if I typed it correctly. But for now, since we're using class-based components, let's just stay consistent with class-based components. So I'm going to comment out this good stuff here. Okay, so now what's going to happen is when we click that button, or when the user clicks the button, we're going to call this.props.handleClick. What is this referring to? Well, glad you asked. That's referring to this function that's going to get called. So now when you click that button, the handle click prop is pointing to increment count. So this function is going to get invoked, even though we're clicking it from within the button component, right? So this is, again, tied to this function over here. So when we click that button, we're going to increment the count in our parent. That value will change based on doing this.setState. Again, that's going to be a little different. If you're working with a function, you got to use the useState hook, which we talked about in lecture. But either way, we need to update the state value, not manually. Again, big disclaimer, do not update props or state values manually, as in don't just assign directly to the values. You need to do it the React way, else your updating is not going to work as you would expect it. So here, when this function gets called, we increment the count. And then whenever that value changes, this value changing will trigger a re-render of this component. Now, I was talking to a student earlier, and one big important note is that this update is asynchronous. And just to show that, I'm going to add, let's put a console log, and let's just actually check the value of this.state.count. Okay, so whenever this function is going to be called, we're going to update state, and then right after that, we're going to check the count value. And let's see what this count value is actually showing us in our output. All right, so let's keep that in there. Let's see what. All right, we got increment count not defined. That's because we don't get counts there. Nope, that's not what we want. This. So this again is a keyword for a class instance. So I was missing my this. So without the this, it's thinking it's some value that's in this function. It's thinking, hey, you have a const increment count. If you don't add the this, it's going to look for a local variable called increment count. That's why the this keyword is important, and I omitted it. So I need this here. I also need this dot state dot count because the state value is tied to my class. So that's what the this value is. I'm doing dot state, which is this object here, and then dot count, which is the value here. Likewise, for increment count, this is a member of this class. So I do this dot increment count to reference this function. All right, without it, again, they're gonna, if I undo this, these are just gonna be local variables. They're gonna be looking in this scope of code. So this scope of code is gonna say, hey, is there an increment count? Is there a count value? And the answer is no, so I got an error down here, which is what you guys see in my output. So always remember to have a this if you're using class-based components. Questions about the this keyword? All right, I'm gonna save that. Hopefully that fixes my errors. All right, looks like my server is up and running. I don't have any errors, so I got compiled successfully. High five to myself. And all right, so let's try clicking this. Okay, there we go. It's working again. Again, kind of, I'm a visual person. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm trying to point out, but just envision a parent component up top and then two children components down below. One of them is the button. It's basically triggering an event that the parent handles. The parent is managing the data and passing it down to your output component. So we get the same result as we had before, except now these are two separate components. And the reason I wanted to go through this example is because, again, you're going to see this design very often where, one component might update some values, or you want to update some values. The parent is usually the place where you want to manage that data so that it can both accept like an update and pass it down to any child components. Again, we might have multiple child components that rely on this value. Like we could have two outputs now. Not that it would make sense, but now these are going to use all the same count value, so they're going to be updating together, right? But the one thing I wanted to check, let me get rid of this, is let's look at our output. So I'm going to refresh my page so we reset everything. I'm going to bring up my property inspector, which is Alt Option I. There we go, and go to my console. So you guys should see a console tab if you're in Chrome. Firefox has something similar. So I go to console, and now anything I do console log to, it's going to come out here. So let's actually click this button once, and let's see what value we expect. So right now we're at 0. If I look at my code here, I'm doing a console.log after I increment my count. So the first time I hit the button, I should expect my count value to go to 1, and therefore I should expect my count to be 1 right here. All right, so I'm gonna do that. Click me. Notice I got a 0 here, not a 1, even though my output here says I've been clicked 1 time. I guess this plural, we should fix that. But as I click it, now it's 1 in my output, but it's 2 up here. We're kind of delayed. Now, I'm going to call on random students. Jack, can you tell me why it's delayed?
I was the random student from earlier when we talked about this, but it's because it's processed asynchronously. Like it will just do that whenever, but it can't be relied on to be accurate at the moment that you're going to try to grab it. So it's you shouldn't rely on that set state for like real time display of information because it'll be wrong by at least a step.
Yep, Jack has it correct. So important thing to remember, again, these are all new concepts, so easy to forget. It's not obvious, definitely by the JavaScript that we've done before where everything's been synchronous. This call is asynchronous. What that means, it's going to be done on its own time. It's not going to execute and complete right at this moment. So this call will say, hey, update the value of count at some point in the future. But that future isn't like immediate. So when we get to line 15, this.state.count is actually using the previous value that we had at like before this function even got called. Because these two lines get executed synchronously, as in one by one, but this doesn't actually complete until later. Again, it's a foreign concept because again, everything we've doing up to this point has been synchronous. Like we expect line 1 to complete before line 2. And that's, I mean, this line is completing, but this logic here is not actually being executed just this moment. And that's part of asynchronous JavaScript, which we haven't talked about too much. It's just part of the game here.
So Ankur, what's the latest it can complete? Because it's rendering it correctly when you call output component. So is the latest it can complete before the output component call? Because that's expecting a
good question. So with a class-based component, this render is gonna update anytime one of these values change. So if you change increment count, or if you change count, this render will automatically be triggered. So what React is doing is basically it's checking every time if anything's changed. If it noticed that, hey, this .state changed, it will then cause a render here. So when this function actually completes its logic, as in when it actually updates count, that is the point in time where this render actually happens. There's a little more to it, as in the first time this function is created, this render happens one time. But at any future point, the render will not be triggered unless you manually force it to trigger, which is really rare, or you update some values that your components rely on. So in this case, count, whenever it updates, we don't know when it will be necessarily. Whenever it does update, this render will handle the updating of it. All right, so how were the challenges from this afternoon? Were you guys kind of still lost with states and props? Again, difficult concept. Don't feel bad if you're like, I have no idea why these values aren't what I expect them or how to pass them around. Or again, React is not simple by any means. So yeah, let me stop my share here.